I'm indeed part of CERN's knowledge transfer group, as Javier mentioned. I think an important small disclaimer we should make: we are not here on behalf of CERN. I mean, talking in name of CERN. We're basically talking in our own name and basically our experience of working together on a number of these topics. And in particular, so maybe a little bit of history. Why am I talking here? So I'm a software engineer. When I finished my studies in Belgium, in Leuven, I started for a small startup company called Mind, who offered Linux and ECOS consultancy and services for industry. So back then I had a lot to do with questions of GPL, LGPL licensing, especially in a commercial context, and how to integrate it into proprietary products. So it's quite fun when I joined CERN almost 13 years later. A number of these topics coming back in a different context now, and in particular in the context of CERN, having working with colleagues like Javier, asking questions like, instead of asking can we do this or can we do that, no, can you find a legal reasoning by which we can achieve this or can we achieve that? Can we make our designs freely available, and what legal tools do you see that can help us do that? And that's really the spirit of this talk, because Javier indeed came with the question. If you guys or somebody here develops a nice HDL code for, I don't know, decoding something related to video, and Samsung decides to ship an ASIC based on that code, what obligations does Samsung have, for example, in terms of making available the source code on which it was based, and under which license does it have to be mentioned? So. That's why this talk, the open question, to what extent does shipping of ASICs have any obligations associated with it based on the GPL3? Now, the basic of licensing, I'm not going to spend too much time on it. As you know, you can only attach conditions to things which people would otherwise not be allowed to do. So, if, for example, you want to copy a piece of work, I can attach a piece of paper here I drew. I can attach a condition to it because you're not allowed to just copy it. You need my permission, so I can tell you, well, you're only allowed to do that provided you meet these conditions. So in the context of copyright, this means reproduction of the work, this means adaptation of the work, translation of the work, and that's in fact the whole idea around which the GPL is based, to maximize, let's say, the copyleft effect of the license by imposing conditions on each of those actions that otherwise would be infringement of the copyright of the author. Now, a key question which Javier raised in his talk is which rights are infringed by this? By basically, the whole process starting from the HDL code until you have your ASIC. Well, there's nothing that prohibits you from doing that. This is not a work anymore in the sense of copyright. So, in essence, the copyright law that's somewhere at that boundary line, it ceases to apply, because you're not shipping a work in the sense of copyright law. Shipping the HDL itself is of course a work and subject to copyright. Now, does that mean that that's the end of the story? That would be a rather short talk. I could go and sit down, so I don't think so. So, as Javier mentioned, the GPL says something different. It doesn't just mention copyright. It also means copyright-like laws that apply to other kinds of works, such as semiconductor masks. So, of course, one can argue as a lawyer whether copyright-like is really a very precise statement, but let's take that to the side. But it does mention something called semiconductor masks. So I'm not sure if many of you have been in contact with this legislation which covers semiconductor masks, which, by the way, also technically the name is quite misleading, because if you look at the legislation, it's actually much broader than just semiconductor masks. So I just want to take the opportunity to introduce you briefly to this piece of legislation and its history, so you better understand as well how it applies today. So it also, in 1984, if I look around the room, many of you were not around yet. Some of you were. I was around. I was playing with Conan the Barbarian on my father's Apple II. And it was a time when Intel already the 286 was on the market for a while. It was preparing, in fact, the 386 series, which was, at least for a while, one of the most commercially successful series of processors for Intel. In 1984, about 2 million IBM PCs and clones were sold. It was growing exponentially. And the US chip making industry was getting quite nervous about getting their market share eaten away by competitors. So under pressure of and lobbying, rather than pressure, of the semiconductor industry in the US, the Semiconductor Chip Protection Act of 1984 was enacted. So you see a press release of Intel's first registration under that new Chip Protection Act. I will go on the contents of that act later, January 21st, 1985. And of course, it didn't remain just a US matter, because it's called, I call it a bit mockingly, the arm-twisting reciprocity provision. So, in fact, the SCPA says, because it was a US law, so how did it deal with, in fact, other countries? Well, basically the following, that the US gave the same rights to other countries, which would, if it provided, they respected also the rights established under the SCPA in the US. So it's different than what is typically the national treatment effect, whereby normally every country says, well, we afford the same treatment to other nationals under the same procedures as we do. No, it's reciprocity. So basically, unless you obey our rules, we will not obey your rules either. It's a subtle difference, but it will have an effect which I will talk about later. So in Europe, it was also quite quickly entered into legislation with the Council directive. As you see, also a slight change of terminology here, not on masks, but on protection of topographies of semiconductor products. And there was a WIPO treaty, which in the end was did not enter into force, but was integrated into the TRIPS agreement. I will not go into too much legal detail on that. But as I mentioned before, take the word masks and topography not in the technical sense that you're used to doing to using them, because as you'll see later, they are defined in a very specific way. And in fact, this is for me the most important message of what I want to bring today, because of course I'm not going to give you an overview of all the possible legislations and all the definitions. I just took here what we defined in the end in Europe in practice for this legislation, what the effects are, and what it therefore could mean in terms of the effect of shipping ASICs based on HDL code, which is licensed under GPL3. So first, as I meant before, topography, don't take it in the exact sense that you know it, so how is it defined in the law? The topography of a semiconductor product shall mean a series of related images, however fixed or encoded, so this is my emphasis added, so however fixed or encoded, representing the three-dimensional pattern of the layers of which a semiconductor product is composed, and in which series each image has the pattern or part of the pattern of the surface, blah blah blah, at any stage of its manufacture. So, although it's quite specific, talks about things like images and three-dimensional representation, it also takes a lot of abstraction in the sense of that it doesn't define how it should be fixed or encoded, as long as the resulting technical effect is what is meant by the law, and also at any stage of its manufacture, so it's not only at the last stage, it can be any form of intermediate level of abstraction going towards your final product, which is a semiconductor product. Now, what are the criteria for protection? It's basically the same criteria, more or less the same threshold as copyright law. So the result of its creator's own intellectual efforts, so it must be, let's say, yours originally, not in the sense of original of something great, but you haven't stolen it basically from somebody else. And it's not commonplace in the semiconductor industry. What are the exclusive rights? And here is the point. So why does this actually allow you to enforce certain rights that copyright doesn't? Because it gives you, or the author, the exclusive right to reproduce and to commercially exploit and import the topography of the semiconductor product based on it. Although reverse engineering itself is not prohibited. But that means that here you have an anchor that you don't have under copyright to actually prevent others from just, let's say, reproducing your design. And if it allows you to prevent others to do so, it means it also allows you to attach conditions to it, which means copyleft conditions. Now, a practical difficulty with the law, which I will come to as well in a second, is registration. So, in fact, the law is quite broad enough that many countries have the freedom to implement that law the way they want, and especially on the topic of registration, which is something, I think the nice thing about copyright and why the GPL and other licenses work very well is that there are no formalities involved. Copyright just arises, end of the story. Semiconductor topographies can also arise automatically if the country chooses to implement it in this way, and that's done in the UK and Ireland and Belgium. It is subject to registration within 2 years' time after you've actually created it in most of the other EU countries, which costs time and money, must be done within 2 years. But that's not the end of the world for me. I'll come to that in a second. Duration is shorter, much shorter than copyright protection. 10 years from either the end of the calendar year in which the topography is first commercially exploited, and commercially exploited is not meant in that you have to actually sell it. So even making it available for licensing, even therefore also under an open source license like GPL, is also making commercially available, just to be clear. Or the end of the year, of the calendar year in which the application for registration has been filed in due form, when you have to actually register it. Now, I want to take a bit of abstraction of this question of, let's say, registration by country, because if you look at two, let's say two things which are interlinked with each other. The first, that there are countries in which registration is not required. So that means the topography arises automatically. Secondly, that there is a right or a principle of reciprocity between countries, in particular with the US that I mentioned earlier. So not that you have to re-register or reapply in the US, but in fact there is a reciprocity in the recognition of the right. Does mean that there is maybe not a global, but at least some significant countries in which your rights arise automatically and in which you can enforce your, let's say, a license based on that towards a third party. So therefore also a copyleft license like GPL. So therefore, my answer is in fact, yes, shipping is conveying in the sense of the GPL v3, maybe not as a kind of default worldwide, but the answer is yes, based on the unregistered topography design right. A second answer is it depends, which also is still possible. That you can choose to register a topography. I know that for a community, let's say an open source community, it's maybe not the most practical thing to do, but in case you feel that somebody is actually shipping your design against your permission and that you still have an opportunity to register it, you can actually still do it. Because as you saw before, it's either the two events that determine the length of the duration of the right. And a third answer could be, well, it could also be no, in case only jurisdictions are involved where there is no equivalent legislation enacted. So, what I would say the key message is that if I were a company stealing your designs, stealing between brackets, using your designs without respecting your copyleft licenses, I would think about it twice, because even though it is not entirely universally applicable, there is a non-theoretical possibility that it could be used against me in some jurisdictions. And that's what the key message would be for me, so that yes, it is actually a risk to not respect the, to not ship, to not comply with the GPL v3 when shipping ASICs based on an open source or GPL HDL design. I hope that was not too boring for you, and it was too legal, but thanks a lot for your attention.
So, just one question I can't resist. Isn't this the nail in the coffin for GPL3 for ASICs? Because I mean, in the previous talk, we figured out that there's no way of making an ASIC without some proprietary IP in it. Mm-hmm. And now you tell us that shipping is conveying, so there's no way to comply, right?
So, if indeed only, this is for me important, the debate that you have. So, if you can only do that last step by shipping proprietary code, the answer should be yes. But on the other hand, so again, I'm not a hardware designer, so you might need to educate me as well a bit while we talk here. If in the end the ASIC you're shipping is based on the HDL code that you've made available on the GPL3, at least in my view the HDL code itself, although not all the other elements, should be made available by, or let's say given access to by the company shipping the ASIC. So not the proprietary parts, which.
Yeah, I think the difficulty is, I think the problem here is the intent of the people crafting this they actually do want the HDL to be only that part has to be protected and copylefted, but the language of the GPL v3, it says its language includes because the other problem is that the HDL is not enough to create the mask set. So there is this problem in practice. At the end, before you do the final tape out. You have to go through manually in practice. Look at what came out, modify it to fix the final bugs, because the tool, you can never get the tools to get rid of every single bug in the final layout because they have bugs in.
Yeah.
And so the thing that works depends on human input, editing what came out of the tools. And so the HDL alone is not enough to recreate the binary. It's not like compiling software.
And why, so maybe you can explain to me, why would that that last manual step necessarily result in a proprietary license? Because, okay, I understand, these are companies who are doing that, and therefore they impose the licensing.
The problem is that what you're editing is the final, well, it's not the final stuff, it's the stuff that gets fed to the mask making process. And so that encodes very confidential information about the process technology. So that GDS file that you're manipulating has, for example, the SRAM bit cells in there. And you are adding bits of metal or removing bits of metal in that design. And it won't work unless you do that. You can't manufacture it correctly without fixing those bugs. And as Sensor just points out, there's another step we've forgotten, which is once you have the mask in GDS, you then go to a very expensive process with these big clusters of machines through OPC to actually calculate the actual masks that are used in manufacturing. Yeah, that's very proprietary.
Because that today is proprietary because of the negotiation power of the supplier, right, of that service?
No. Okay, let's step back. There's many very expensive things here. That's why there's a protection there. So one is the process technology is billions of dollars. Like, so in terms of software industry, this is way different scale. Like, Samsung just spent $10 billion on a fab, right? And in that fab, they're using a process technology. They don't want people knowing what their restaurants look like. Not only to replicate the technology, but also for pricing reasons. They don't know how dense the cells are and things like that. And so there's a lot of, that's protected. This last step of LPC correction is also very proprietary because it costs a lot of money to do that. That's part of the mask cost, is actually computing to generate the final version of the masks.
I don't think that the fab being expensive is the problem. It's that last step which is the problem. So
no, the fab being expensive is why you cannot.
Yes,
they don't want to just the masks around. Because they encode the information about the fabrication technology.
How is, again, from my education, how is that price evolving? Because we are talking about something which changes, and I think
it kind of doubles every few years. So it used to be a few billion was all. Now it's 5 billion. Then it was 10 billion, and it's not clear they can do the next one because there's not enough money.
So but, I mean, wouldn't you agree that if you had I mean, I understand because I also have the same problems, but I would agree, I would argue that if you were able to provide the HDL sources and the main scripts for the software, you are not 100% there, definitely not, but you are very close.
Yeah, the language has changed.
Oh yeah, okay. It's just about the language.
Yeah.
I'll come closer.
So I think, if you want to have copyleft, I think that would have to change from GPL3 to make it work. Whether you want copyleft, whether that actually is practical, is a much bigger discussion.
Yes.
I think you could fix this.
Exactly.
Have a new version that would actually get the intent people who want to do copyleft could have with ASICs. So I think that's entirely possible. But you'd have to change the language. Right? Whether you want to have copyleft, getting back to, there's a lot of differences with software. For example, open source software has been hugely successful in infrastructure. Right? Basically, all big companies demand it for infrastructure now. But it works because it only covers one program. But when you're running on a cluster or something, you have the proprietary stuff using the other open source stuff as part of the infrastructure. And it's not contaminated, even if it's copyleft stuff, it's not contaminating the proprietary applications. There's a boundary there that GPL understands at the program level. On a chip, you're making everything on the chip be the same, and you don't have any of those boundaries. And so
that's indeed one of the other open questions. So where are the boundaries? How do you?
Right. And if you don't have those boundaries, nobody's going to give you all patents to everything on the chip. Maybe if it's just academic detector builders, fine. You guys can probably, that's fine. You should do that, but it's not going to work for standard off-the-shelf chips because there's too many people that too much invested in these lumps of code. And it's not going to change. And again, remember that if you draw parallels with software industry, don't be fooled into thinking, oh yeah, everything about open source, everything. No, they use it for certain things and not for others. And the way the systems work lets them do that.
This
Just started, but you're on.
this is
the Fossey Mail a good place to discuss this?
Yeah, probably. We'll set one up. This is turned into a discussion about the practicality of applying LGPL, which I think is very interesting. I also think there should be a broader discussion about what license people should use and why.
And in which context as well, because I think we're talking from different...
Certainly, yes. There are people in academia, industry, hobbyists, of course.
So, I guess this is a question to sort of think about until next year then, or maybe someone already has the answer. Does it make sense from a legal and technological perspective to, maybe not so much for ASICs, but at least I could imagine something like this for FPGAs, to have like an intermediate layer, some sort of proxy, if you will, be it a company or a library or I don't know, another set of abstract tools on which we base open hardware designs, and then the open hardware design is sort of operates strictly on top of this layer, and then everything else under it can be handled in a different way.
So I think that's a question to be discussed, because what I usually do in my talks as well when I discuss open hardware, I think indeed today there is something which is, let's say, missing in the ecosystem, is a kind of, if you want, an equivalent to a platform not in the sense of a technology, but indeed an overall set of elements that on which you can base and say remain within the clean area of open source. So, but what that platform is, I think that's something where maybe the interaction between, in fact, the technical experts and how that can be translated into legal concepts that can actually then be subject to certain licensing conditions, I think will be very fruitful. But indeed, I don't have the answer today, but I think that's exactly the type of discussion which I would find very fruitful and useful. And then also see who can, because once we have that idea as well, who can contribute to this ecosystem, because there are technical contributions, but other contributions as well.
So for FPGAs, I could imagine, like in the simplest technological terms, something like a very simple overlay, which would give you some degree of compatibility and some degree of abstraction. I don't know how well it will work, probably not all that well. For ASICs, I have no idea how something like that would work. A standard cell library?
Just as a kind of a small comment, and not to blow our horns, but for example, CERN, in that context we are investing. So Javier mentioned KiCad. So this is of course only a very small fraction of the whole equation, the tools you actually use to design your hardware. But CERN is in fact investing in the design of KiCad and also facilitating the public to actually donate to contribute to KiCad. And I think maybe that's also where we CERN can play a role as well, by looking into what elements can we contribute to that. Just to say that CERN takes it quite, to its heart, this question as well.
Thumbs up for CERN.
Thanks.
More questions? Comments?
No, if there's no more comments, I don't know, people are starting to leave. It might make sense to do a little bit of a wrap up for the conference, and then we can carry on discussion between anybody else who's around. So David, thank you very much.